Hi, I'm Dr. Soloria. We're going over theories of counseling and psychotherapy and personality, and today looking at existential and person-centered approaches. What we want to cover in this particular discussion is looking at recognizing existential view and that approach in counseling, looking at the principles and techniques of person-centered as well, and evaluating these approaches and their implications, as well as how possibly to integrate. And existential, so let's think of that word. We're looking at, if you saw in your reading for this particular PowerPoint, existential being what going on in life, or givens in life is how the author talked about it. That capacity for self-awareness, oftentimes looking at morality or meaning, freedom, responsibility, anxiety, or being alone, and those being the current struggles in somebody's life. So that existential viewpoint, we're hearing that word a lot. It became kind of trendy, if you will, and that just is talking about what's going on for somebody else. Having this freedom and responsibility. So again, we're looking at that person, not person-centered just yet, but that person and the things going on for them in their life, this core internal system. And then what is their identity, the relationship? So looking at that isolation or being alone, loneliness, and then lastly, those core concepts of searching for meaning. And that has to do with Frankl. We'll get to that in just a second. So the existential approach is asking that client to look deeper. What is going on for them in their own nature? Are they struggling with anxiety or despair, loneliness, again, that isolation? So what's going on in their life? And how are they making meaning of that? Are they able to be creative? So if we see grief and despair and loneliness, we're probably inhibited in creativity, and also the isolation, needing love, companionship, connection with others. And also your existential concepts, looking for significance. That's where Frankl comes in, that word. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, is highly influential when we're looking at that significance and that implication for existential. And also, as the client, and they're shaping their own view of their life and what's going on, that if they feel like they don't have control, or accepting the circumstances that they're in. So those are some pieces that we want to look at in existential. Sorry. Also, I mentioned Frankl. I would love for you to take some time to look at his work. And I know there are several other contributors to this. I have a bit of a bias, if I'm honest, about Viktor Frankl and his work. I find it very interesting. I've referenced his book, Man's Search for Meaning, in your references in this PowerPoint. But what is he talking about? And he found this kind of established this because of his, I'm looking at this particular book reference in your syllabus. He was in a Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz, as well as another one. And figuring out what that search for meaning was for him in those experiences. Incredibly creative and interesting to read, heart-wrenching at times to read that information, but how he came through that and how he made that search for meaning and that existential experience, or a crisis for him, and what was going on in his life. Super interesting. There's a blurb about him, obviously, in this book, but The Man's Search for Meaning, when you get a chance, I would add that to a reading list. I often tell many, many people to read that book or just have it on the bookshelf. It's very interesting to me. You may not find it so as much as I do. So When we look at person-centered and Carl Rogers, so that's actualization, self-concept and being congruent with the self. Um, as a therapist, we are wanting to create in a person-centered. So we're thinking about the client in the room, and we're creating a safe space for them, very accepting, and their terms being growth promoting. So I am for that client. And I would think as we hear that, you would say to yourself, maybe, that sounds obvious, Wendy or Dr. Soloria. Yeah. So, yeah, it can be obvious. And I think at times it can be difficult because we want to make meaning of something that we're hearing. And we, in person centered, is going to say, you're allowing them to lead that. So, reflective listening, that is a skill. However, in this particular core concept for person-centered, we want to look at reflective listening as you're just taking in the information that was given to you and then reflecting that back. So, what I heard you say was that Viktor Frankl's research is very interesting to you. That is reflective listening. I didn't make meaning out of what was stated. I just reflected it back. And I didn't try to say, well, have you looked at these other resources? Or I don't think that's as interesting as you think it is. So I'm not judging it, making meaning of it, other than I'm reflecting it back to somebody. So in that, moving into minimal interpretation. I'm not interpreting what it means for Dr. Soloria to think Frankl's work is interesting. I'm just stating that it is. And I'm not saying, well, this may have a background in X, Y, and Z. So while we were looking at psychoanalytic theory, and it's looking in the past of like, that's why that's happening. That's why they think that man's search for meaning is so interesting. It's just minimal interpretation. You're just hearing them. It's very client-led. So as that client comes in and you have created this safe space, you are leading from them. What they bring to the room is what's going on in the room. It's pretty fluid. It's not as structured as some that we'll see in other discussions. So it's, they came in, they're stressed about school. Or they came in and they're stressed about their marriage. They came in and their child had a meltdown. That's where we're going. So that's a little bit ambiguous in terms of, well, what do we do? How do we create this treatment plan? And we'll get into more of those in not maybe as much in here as we will in other courses, like how do I create a treatment plan, but I really like person-centered. To answer that question early, I suppose, I usually tell everybody, I have an agenda, I have a treatment plan because that person has given me goals, but I'm also going to lead with, well, let's see what they brought. Maybe they're on some weeks they are doing well and they don't really know what to talk about, but they want to be consistent with their therapeutic experience and they go with what you're going to teach. And then other times it's, the child had a meltdown in the parking lot and they had to sit on the ground by the child to keep them from getting run over. So that would be what you would lead with. Like, well, what did it feel like to sit by your child as they had a meltdown? And you would just reflectively listen back to that and not interpret what it meant or not interpret, that they don't want to do what you had planned because they just want to talk about the XYZ. So that's what this person-centered core concept looks like. Common uses for person-centered as listed is depression, anxiety, their own identity, because we're looking at an existential type of process, right? The benefits may be that you're increasing self-exploration. You're empowering them. Maybe in this setting, in this safe environment, maybe the only place they've been empowered. And so having them explore who they are, what they think, and what they feel is very, very empowering for them and encouraging. And maybe with more structure, with other theories, that it would be less empowering for that particular client. It's all based on that client. So we can't say this works with this one and it doesn't work with this one or XYZ. Some limitation is for some counselors, the lack of structure feels very confusing or not really focused enough. And it can be for some clients as well. If you have a very cerebral client, this might be difficult to be so ethereal, if you will. But it can honor that spiritual framework and getting into a safe space or an environment where that person can holistically explore self and looking at that self-exploration around spirituality and their own identity, or at times even what they believe or don't believe spiritually. And so there's an easy way to kind of integrate their beliefs into that particular modality. So, as we complete that discussion, I would encourage you to continue to read as I offered more reading material in this particular discussion and follow up with your discussion questions. So, we should be trucking along with probably getting a little more in depth in your discussion questions. Keep adding extra resources to those discussions for yourself as you're reading more and more materials. You're doing a good job. Keep it up. And here are your references. Again, I made this reference for Man's Search for Meaning. I know it sounds like I plugged this book. I get nothing for plugging this book other than you get to read something over your break that may be interesting or enlightening, or maybe you have already read it and understand what I'm talking about. So I hope you have a good week, and we will talk to you soon.